later. And I'm just going to go around the room here, and we'll just real quickly say who we are and what our role is here. So I'm Anya Weber, and I work on the marketing and communications team doing writing and editing, and I'm also one of the people who coordinates this series of Brown Bag Talks.
And I'm Lara Inning Donovan. I'm on the training team, training and TA team, and I also oversee the employment services program.
Hi, I'm Kelly Haynes. I'm a researcher here at ICI, and most of my work is focused on vocational rehabilitation.
Hi, my name is David Helm. I'm director of the LEN program. Mostly work over at Children's Hospital, but also work with our Gopin Fellow and Crocker Fellows here over at ICI.
I'm Oliver. I'm a research study coordinator on the state systems teams here.
I'm Jonathan Kelleher. I'm the receptionist and office assistant here at ICI.
I'm Adi Bahrani. I'm a master's student here, and I'm working on Autism Bangladesh project as a GA project.
Hi, I'm Melanie McLaughlin, and I'm an independent contractor, and I do media-related work, public relations-related work, and I was formerly the Parker Fellow, and I am the parent of a child with a developmental and intellectual disability.
My name is Kara Narby. I'm a PhD student and research assistant working with the state systems team. And I'm actually also autistic, and I'm really glad that you are doing this brown bag session, because I've definitely experienced people getting in my face kind of about my use of identity first language, sort of misapprehending that I'm autistic myself, or still arguing with me sort of after knowing that. So yeah.
Yeah, people going, aren't you a person with autism?
Right,
Things like that.
like I wouldn't know, oh, you really want to use this other language, and you're like, okay. So anyway, I'm glad.
Hi, I'm also Melanie. I'm Melanie Jordan, and I work with Laura on the training and technical assistance team. We do a lot of training with providers around deployment first and community deployment. And I also work, I work across 5 projects at ICI these days. So we're no longer just part of it. Well, many of us are no longer just a part of a team. We're across a lot of projects here.
Cool. And Finn, you want to do a little intro for yourself?
Hi, I'm Finn Gardiner, and I will be talking this afternoon, this brown bag session. I'm the Walensky Gopin for 2015 to 2016. I'm working on a mentoring project that matches autistic adults with other autistic adults to help them, to help each other with things like education, employment, navigating government services, and other life skills. Mostly it's been education and employment. And in addition to that, I'm also working on some guides and other tools that the community can use after the fellowship is over.
So let me hand you these so you can jump right into your presentation, Finn. Okay. Let's see here. And you can go full screen with your slides.
Okay.
Hey, Alberto, welcome. Come on in.
Hi. All right, so welcome to a brief introduction on identity first language.
Then you want to let's get rid of the control panel there.
Minimize.
Yeah.
Oh, I see it's an X.
Yeah. Can you drag it? Oh, what about that orange arrow? Does that make it? There we go.
Makes it smaller.
All right.
Okay, so we start with the question, what are person first and identity first language? Let's go backwards. So person and identity first language are 2 language styles that people use to refer to people with disabilities or disabled people. And both of them come from well-meaning standpoints, but they are very different. Person-first language tries to de-emphasize the individual, de-emphasize the disability, focusing on the individual instead. Some examples of person-first language are a person with cerebral palsy, a person with autism, a person with an intellectual disability, a person with a mobility disability. Well, identity-first language puts the emphasis on people's cultural identity in relation to their disability. For example, deaf people, blind people, autistic people. And I have a list of some of these here. So you have, for person first, you have somebody like a person with deafness or hearing loss, individuals with autism, people with Down syndrome, person with ADHD, person with cerebral palsy, persons with disabilities, versus identity first, which would be autistic people, deaf person, disabled person, blind person, schizophrenic individual, and bipolar people. So why do some communities prefer person-first language? It's a contentious issue in disability communities, and there are a lot of people, especially parents and advocates outside the disability community, and people without disabilities or non-disabled people often prefer it. And certain people with disabilities prefer person-first language for themselves. So let's find out why they prefer it. So some disability communities have struggled with an essentialist mindset that have treated their diagnosis as their most defining characteristic, leading activists to turn toward person-first language. So, for example, you might have somebody who has a mobility disability. They may have cerebral palsy. They may have experienced paralysis or something. And they may use a wheelchair. So some people will go, you are like, oh, they're bound, they're wheelchair bound. They are or sometimes you hear people, they talk about loading a bus or something. We have to get all these wheelchairs onto the bus. Not people in a wheelchair, but the wheelchairs, as though there's nobody inside the chair. So this kind of thinking leads people, it pushes them to person-first language. And so this argument supporting person-first language sees people as being whole people, sort of a holistic mindset, with disability only being part of their experience. And that does work for some people. It doesn't work for me personally, but I'm going to get to that later. But, well, it partly works for me. But anyway. So these people, they think, oh, if you say a deaf person or something, you are completely defining me by my disability, and I'd rather you see me as a whole person. But that's a false dichotomy. We're going to find out why some people prefer identity-first language. So, here are some examples. Autism, somebody who's autistic might think that autism is an intrinsic part of who I am. You can't really separate it from me. And to quote Ari Naiman from the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, I'm not carrying my autism with me, am I? I consider myself, and for a deaf person, I consider myself part of the deaf community. It's part of my culture. Or, you wouldn't say person with blackness, would you? And what you consider a disability is just the way I interpret the world. These are not exhaustive, they're just examples of how people may come to prefer identity-first language. Some of those are my own personal beliefs about myself, specifically that you wouldn't say a person with blackness, would you? And autism is an intrinsic part of who I am, and I am not carrying my autism with me. I'm not deaf, so that doesn't personally apply to me. So identity-first language comes from a philosophical approach to conceptualizing disability as something that is inseparable from a person's experience. That while it is not the totality of somebody's experience, it pervades it. It colors everything about them and their experience, the way they perceive the world, and to separate it feels kind of artificial. For example, I'm autistic. The way I see the world, the way I interact with people and objects around me is completely influenced by that. And even in the diagnostic literature, something like autism is referred to as a pervasive developmental disorder. The category PDD no longer exists, but it still falls under that category. And the idea of pervasiveness is one of the reasons why a lot of autistic people lean toward using identity-first language as opposed to person-first language. Of course, that's not universal, but it does apply to me, and it does apply to several other autistic advocates. So it leans toward a holistic model of disability as opposed to an oppositional one. So the person-first approach, in some cases, is sort of oppositional. Here's me, and here's my disability, not here's my disability, it is part of me. So it's like that example that I gave about, like, I don't carry my autism with me, do I? So it's not, oh, I'm gonna put my autism over here. So that's one of the reasons why. So it sees disability as natural and opposes artificial separation while also avoiding dehumanization. So there are some words you can use as adjectives that are respectful and affirming, autistic, blind, deaf. But there are some words that you should probably not use if you don't belong to a specific community yourself, like crippled. There are some disabled people who have reclaimed that word, but it's not something that you should use if you don't have a mobility disability and reclaim that word. But as all things in life, it's complicated. Like Facebook relationships. So person first and identity first language varies from community to community. So generally speaking, with physical and intellectual disabilities, a lot of these people prefer person first language. Of course, not everybody, but so in these people, you hear things like people with Down syndrome, people with cerebral palsy, people with Williams syndrome, people with Landau-Kleffner syndrome, people with an intellectual disability, or people with lower body paralysis, things like that, or as opposed to certain sensory and developmental disabilities prefer identity first language. So autistic people, deaf people, blind people, and it varies with psychiatric disability. Some people will say I'm bipolar or bipolar people, whereas some other people might say I have bipolar disorder or I have schizophrenia as opposed to I am schizophrenic. Of course, I don't really see anxiety and depression being used as adjectives. I don't say I am anxious to refer to somebody who has an anxiety disorder, or I am depressed to refer to somebody who has that has a depressive disorder. Because I am anxious can be a temporary state, and I am depressed can also be a temporary state. But I have an anxiety disorder is a continuing thing, or I have depression is a continuing thing. Now, I wonder if some of that might be a limitation of the English language, because in Spanish you could say, I am anxious, with estar, which is like a temporary to be, or soy, which is like a more permanent state, but English does not have that distinction. Alberto, you can chime in, and I think that might go for Italian too.
I never thought about that. That's interesting.
Yeah, I think that might work for Italian too. Because I think Italian does have that difference as well. So the best way, I digress, the best way to be respectful to people with disabilities or disabled people is to use the term they prefer. And I have a video by Amethyst Shaper, who is an autistic self-advocate who posts videos on YouTube under the Ask an Autistic channel. And this is an excerpt from Ask an Autistic, What Not to Say to Autistic People.
In the same vein, if somebody introduces themselves or somebody comes up to you as autistic, please do not correct them and say, don't you mean you're a person with autism? You have to put the person first. The reason for this one is twofold. Firstly, most autistic people actually prefer to use identity first, not person first language. This is the same as the blind and the deaf community, who largely prefer to use identity first language. So instead of a person with autism, most autistic adults and self-advocates that I've spoken to prefer autistic person. Secondly, even if that wasn't the case, every autistic person has the right to choose how they introduce themselves, how they identify. They are the autistic ones. It is their disability. And so if they want to be autistic, a person with autism, an Aspie, an Aspergerian, a Spectrumite, they get to decide what they're called. And so you should not correct them. You should just roll with it, even if you don't necessarily agree.
So here's my personal view on it. Like many other autistic people, I prefer autistic person over person with autism, which I consider inaccurate for the reasons I mentioned before. Because I can't exactly put my autism here and step away from it. It doesn't work. So this is why it's because I feel that I can't be separated from my autism and still be me. Person with autism creates an artificial separation that I don't think exists in my case. So if somebody walks up to me and calls me a person with autism or says, "Don't you mean you're a person with autism?" I will correct you because it doesn't work. It's not what I want to be called. And in order to respect people, you should refer to them the way they want to be called. And so, what do you think anyway? I'm curious. It's time for questions.
I'd be curious. I have a daughter with Down syndrome.
Mm-hmm.
So I was looking on the list of things that you sort of had there, and I was wondering how I would refer to her with identity first language, or how, she's not old enough yet to articulate to me how she would prefer to be identified, which is the first way that I would want to ask. But if I was having this discussion with somebody, we were talking about identity first versus person first, how I would describe her, and I felt like sort of one of the options you had there was disabled person, but I feel like that's not the totality of her differences, and so I'm not sure. And I don't know, Down syndrome person doesn't feel right to me. So intellectually disabled person, I guess. I don't know, I'm not really sure. So I'm curious about that.
It's very uncommon to see Down syndrome being used as an adjective anyway. Intellectually disabled, yes. But usually the common term, even among people with Down syndrome themselves, is people with Down syndrome. Mm-hmm. I think that it's something for her to decide ultimately. Yeah. I would just wait and see how she prefers to refer to herself.
And in the meantime, just person with Down syndrome.
Yeah.
Okay.
In some of the work that we've done here with hospitals, trying to work with hospital staff on using more respectful language, there's a big tendency in the medical profession to put the disability first, I think because it's seen as a diagnosis primarily. So I heard a lot from nurses and doctors of Down syndrome patient, CP patient, they always put that first. And that was one of the things that we were telling them not to do in the training. So
it depends on the disability.
But it depends on the disability.
And I think it also, like you said, depends on the person's choice. Because I teach a course at Tufts Medical School with for pediatric residents, and we say the same thing to them. It's part of our course curriculum is that we ask them to do person first language, and I have to talk to our team to sort of, I'd love to share your PowerPoint with them or maybe some of your perspective with them to talk to them about how we can think about our curriculum in a broader way so that we're not instructing doctors for person first language if that's not always what people want.
Mm-hmm. And probably goes for our trainings too.
Well, I guess what I'm thinking is, respect. I agree with everything. I mean, it makes all the sense in the world. It really is up to the individual how they identify and how they want to be referred. Absolutely. I can't imagine anybody that would disagree with that. I mean, that's just but again, those of us in the field, I think everybody is wanting to be respectful. I think respect is a thing. I think, in the field, I know the person first language came from labeling, right? And how in the past, based on the history of the disability field, et cetera, that are wanting to change the perception of society, that we don't want folks to be labeled and to be generalized and to be, disrespected. So it's all about respect. So I think that's where certainly in the field, the person first language comes from.
Yeah, I think that it comes from a good place. And I, read a lot of things about how disability was, treated rhetorically in the past, where people would use labels that would now be considered insulting, and things like mental subnormality and idiot and moron, imbecile,
retarded.
You don't hear that one as most people use it as an insult because it's no longer the diagnostic category.
Teenagers use it a lot. Teenagers still use it a lot, unfortunately.
Yeah, as an insult.
Mm-hmm. But I think, we want society to not see people as they're just, we all understand both sides of this, so I don't think I need to explain it. One question I would have, or one comment, is no matter how much attention has been paid to person first language, you never hear the media using it. And I wondered, or the newspaper or the news, it's very, very consistent that
Or even like parking spaces, handicap.
And I wonder
Yeah, I
if
was
it's just
gonna
like
say, they use
economics,
words
there's
that-
less words,
yeah.
so it's less expensive, you know?
Yeah,
Or it's
journalists, you know, they have to.
Well, we just mentioned the R word, and
Well,
that
yeah,
was relatively recently that sort of what official sort of documentation changed in terms of that.
Yeah, I think
That's
they
right.
only changed it to intellectual disability in the DSM-5.
Yeah.
But it become used in the field a few years before that. Because I remember the shift happening in the past decade. Like when I was reading about these things about 10 years ago, it was still called mental retardation.
Well, DDS only just changed their name
Right,
a
yeah.
couple years ago.
'Cause it was
DMR
Well,
until like a few years ago, and it's like
Which is
2013 or
probably
something.
a good
One
idea
of our
they changed it,
open fellows
especially if
Right, but
people
it's sad
don't
that it took
have
them that long.
intellectual disabilities.
But I mean, I think with the media and stuff, I mean, you still have the handicap parking spots.
Yeah.
You still have the
Nobody even says
handicap.
anymore unless you're
Well,
talking about a parking
it's out
space.
there though, you know? They don't say the parking spot for people with disabilities or
Well,
whatever
that's-
else you
I
might
think
say.
that's a lot more words,
So-
that'd be a bigger
Exactly.
sign.
I think that's what Melanie's, getting at too, is the
Accessible
editing.
parking would be
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah,
what
that
about
would
the
be
news,
nice.
though? What
And you
about
see that
accessible?
sometimes. Yeah,
What
you see
about,
accessible
like,
van
newscasters?
spots, but
Well, I know
It's the same
from-
thing. It's harder to say. It's
Yeah.
sort of like when you're trying to say it out. It's just a matter of I think expediency and
Yeah.
editing that they feel like it's quicker and more precise, and
Yeah.
they get called out a lot on it. A lot of times I don't feel like they respond to the.
But
being
when
called
you're on the air, it kind of, unless you really are used to saying it and have said it so often, it's kind of, they might slip up a bit, but I mean, it's worth it that say it and get used to it. Like, once you get used to it,
Yeah, it is easy.
yeah. So, I mean, even if you have a couple of newscasts where you stumble over the word, I mean, it's out there because it's something that people want to hear about or people are concerned about. So the news should and public relations should.
Yeah, they should get it right. I agree. Well, like with
Well,
Down
what's
syndrome,
right?
even people
what's
often who always say Downs, you know what I mean? And it's like, it's actually John Langdon Down, and it was no S, and blah, 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 this whole thing. But yeah, I mean, it's people get it
I
wrong
think
all the time.
Down's syndrome, with an apostrophe S, that I've seen in literature before, but I think that also might be something vaguely cultural, because I think in the UK it is written as Downs apostrophe S syndrome. It's Downs syndrome over there.
Yeah, it's
oh,
interesting.
okay.
And I think,
Gotcha.
but for some reason, Asperger's syndrome, it seems to be the other way around, where I see Asperger syndrome a lot in Asperger syndrome a lot in British literature.
Right,
and Asperger's.
Yeah.
I want to make sure we get some of the people who are joining us remotely, so get their perspectives on this too. So Cindy Thomas had said, given the varied perspectives on this issue, how do we approach this on a broader level? So when we're doing a training, when we're developing publications, given that we've said we have to go with the preference of the specific person that we're writing about, or of a specific group of people, how do we approach that on a more global ICI level? What do you all think?
Have it be protocol to ask.
Yeah.
Well, what if I'm writing an article? Let's say that I'm writing an article that is looking at autistic people and their relationships with people in their family, right? So I'm doing research into a large group of people who may not have agreement as to what they want.
So then which term do you
Yeah.
use? Is that what you're saying?
Alternate between the terms and put a disclaimer there.
Yeah, I think in the case, I would say in the case of an article, stick with one sort of paradigm and explain it. I think there's room to do that in a lot of text, to just have an author's aside and say, this is the language I'm using, this is why. Just in that example, I don't know, in that example, I would just always defer to the people with disabilities themselves. That's my impulse as an autistic person, is to maybe family members who are non-autistic have different feelings, but if there's a conflict between people in their own families, or family members who are not autistic as a population and autistic people as a population, just as a matter of course, I would defer to the people who are directly experiencing the disability.
I think in some cases, and I'm an editor, so I think about this a lot because I wind up editing all the stuff that comes out of the school. But so let's say I'm editing a report that's about employment outcomes for people with disabilities. That's how I would phrase that. I would say people with disabilities. I
Mhm.
wouldn't say disabled people, right? Because that is
Yeah.
that's our house style.
Mhm.
That's how we do it.
I feel like disabled people is more politicized.
And I
It
think
is a
it comes
political
from a
identity.
long history of where person-first language came
Right.
from. And so I think Anya's right in the sense that you want to be respectful to the largest group as possible if you're doing a single sentence or a single
Correct.
title. And so that I think is captured so much more. And partly we do come out of a sort of a healthcare model. And, you talk about cancer patients, so you talk about, you know, some sort of disease type thing first. And I think that's where the problem came out of the disability movement, is that people were saying, I'm not a disease, I'm not a curable entity that you're looking at me under a microscope, I'm a person. And so I think you're right in the sense of it has to be personal preference, but on Cindy and Ina's point, the sort of the larger accepted language has to take preference, I think.
Yeah.
Diane had a comment too.
Yes, Diane had a question for Finn, saying, why is it important to you that people know that you are autistic first and foremost?
Because if I weren't autistic, I wouldn't be me. It's like impossible to separate it from me. So I don't feel that person with autism is not respectful to me, and it is not accurate for me. It's like Cindy had something to say too.
Cindy was responding to people saying we need to go with the preference of the person that we're writing about, and she said, what about in a situation where they're not all of one voice?
And this is why I said we can alternate terms in articles. For example, you could say, well, I don't know about people with disabilities. I feel like now if we were in the UK, disabled people would be completely unremarkable. But I feel like US discourse tends to lean toward person-first language more so than some other places, because I read a lot of things from different places as an interest. So you could probably say people with disabilities, but with a disability like autism, a lot of autistic people perceive people with autism as, I am an outsider and don't really understand how you work. So maybe you could alternate autistic people, or say people on the autism spectrum.
Okay.
So that's better. That's
That
more
would kind of
acceptable
cover-
to the community
yeah.
than autistic. I mean, than people with autism. That's
Yeah,
interesting.
I think in the ranking that I've basically seen, this is anecdotal. Maybe somebody should do a study about it. Maybe I should do a study. I don't know.
It's your dissertation.
People with autism seems to be the least favored, followed by people on the autism spectrum, followed by autistic people at the top.
Well, I think, like you said in the PowerPoint, it's complicated, right? And I like that you were able to articulate that. But I also liked in your PowerPoint how you were able to, you alternated, when you were talking about the concepts so that you could show them side by side and how the differences, what the differences were. So that was actually helpful. And so if there's room, I guess, in the text, back to what you were saying, if there was room in the text to sort of just have this explanation of this is how we're going to do it, and we recognize that people have differences around identity first or person first. In some way that at least you're showing that you're being respectful.
Yeah, let's make the thought process totally clear.
Yeah.
And it's good that you mentioned the comparison made, because in front of Anya, that I used to work for the National Service Inclusion Project, and they had one of the backseats they had me put in the generic photo that they gave the most trainees was a person-first language worksheet, and it had 3 columns what the outdated terms that should be used, what the terms mean or something, or what they're actually saying, and what the new terms are. And maybe we could, if we can want to use that for like training or something, we could add identity first. I don't know.
Can I speak to that question? I know it's directed at you, Finn, and it's your presentation, but the question about why do you want people to know that you're autistic first? Because I'm thinking of how I feel about that question, and it's a little bit different. As I said, I also use Identity First Language. I actually don't think it's important for people to know that I'm autistic unless it's like we're having this discussion or something like that.
Yeah.
And I actually do think of myself as a person, first and foremost, which is exactly why I sort of incorporate autism into that personhood, because I sort of think of myself as constituted as an autistic subject, sort of in the culture that I move in. So when you have a phrase like person with autism, it's discursively separating personhood and autism, where the default personhood is non-autistic, and autism represents something extra, whether it's like something extra that's added or whether it's a deficit. It's something that is an addendum to some default personhood.
Yeah,
So
that's what I was.
Right. No. Right. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
I agree.
So yeah. So I just that's yeah. So sort of my thought process is I don't necessarily need everyone to know in every situation that I'm autistic, but that's exactly why I use the Identity First Language.
Well, I don't talk like what I guess that she meant by letting everybody know. I don't think that she's saying that I was telling everybody. That
Right. Yeah. I didn't want to assume that you were either. Don't worry.
Right. Diane also has is expanding on what she was asking. So let me just get this so I can see it better in this box. So Diane said, for me, having a sister who was considered mentally retarded when she was actually brain injured and is now to be described as developmentally disabled or having a developmental disability, I have a problem with the word disabled. I never actually thought of her as being disabled. And I think the dis does a disservice to folks with DD, just my thought. I also have a loved one with autism who prefers not to be considered as having a disability.
Okay. Let's start talking about the social model of disability, because this is where it's leading. This is where Diane's question is leading to. So I do consider myself to have a disability because because the society I live in is not currently set up to be totally accessible to my needs. That is the social model or definition of a disability. So if somebody has a mobility disability, they use a wheelchair, and there are no ramps, there are no curb cuts, there are no elevators, they are disabled by society because they can't get around as easily. When you try to get on the bus, there's a bunch of stairs, you can't go up there. Or you try to walk up, there's a bunch of stairs. There are curves that are difficult to navigate because your chair will go foot. There are a lot of reasons why they would be disabled by society. Or an autistic person, they may experience sensory overload because things are too loud. Like you go into a loud restaurant, there are dishes clanging, and people talking, and bad live music blaring. And it's hard to listen. It's hard to concentrate because you're overloaded by the sensory input, and then a lot of autistic people also have auditory processing difficulties. So it's hard to hear the people you're talking to when you've got 20 other conversations going on around you, and you've got the bad live band playing 80s covers, you've got the dishes clanking, you've got people in the bar, you hear all the drinks being poured, and that's not accessible. It's overloading. Or when you, or dealing with social interaction, people expect you to interpret things in a certain way, and sometimes you have a hard time, or you only understand it intellectually and not intuitively. All these things make things complicated, and therefore it's a form of societal disablement. And of course, I used mobility, disability, and autism as an example, but the same thing could go for a different disability, like an intellectual disability. Schooling is not really set up to be accessible for somebody with an intellectual disability. Because, for example, you can't get a typical high school diploma a lot of the times because you have to pass these high-stakes tests, thanks to No Child Left Behind, that don't give you that advantage. And you're often steered toward work that doesn't help you with your needs. You're often shunted off to sheltered workshops. I won't mention any names, but they still exist here in Massachusetts. So you're being shunted to sheltered workshops. You're not being given competitive employment. You're not being given opportunities because society is not set up to accommodate you. So you're often warehoused in classrooms that are not enriching because they go, oh, you have an intellectual disability. Your IQ is 50. We're not going to give you enrichment. And that does these people a disservice. So that's another example of social disablement. Or being blind or deaf and going online and trying to watch a YouTube video, no captions. You can't lip read, you rely on lip reading, and it's hard, especially if people are talking fast or using a foreign language, and there's no captions. It's hard, and because the people who made the video assume you're hearing like most people, so it's a form of disablement. Or if you're blind and you go on a website, there are no image descriptions, the site is written in Flash, and you can't find where to click because you can't see the screen, that's a form of social disablement because they assume you're sighted. Or giving out books or passing out literature that's not brailled or online, or inaccessible PDFs where everything is a flat image, or an application, or even a complete operating system that doesn't work with a screen reader like JAWS or NVDA or VoiceOver. These are all forms of social disablement.
I'm just asking if Leslie wants to weigh in.
Okay. And so because some things are inaccessible in society for me, I consider myself to be disabled or have a disability. I use either phrasing. Not because I think that I am all my disability, but because I believe very strongly in the social model of disability, which informs my work.
I think that's very interesting, and I was thinking about that before. Like this discussion, we are having this discussion because our society is not built to be inclusive of everybody. So differences sticks up, and it all has to do with identities. For example, I'm Italian, and I have a strong accent, and I'm bald. So all those things are, especially having an accent, and could be a disability in a way, but because where I live, most of the people don't really pay too much attention to my accent. Like, it's not a barrier to me too much. So I don't feel that as a strong identity. I can perceive me as a person. But I do notice that if I'm with people who do have issues with a different accent, I start to realize, okay, I'm not Alberto anymore here. Here I'm an Italian with an accent.
Yeah.
So I was just interested in
Yeah, it's like people have used the culture analogy before. Like somebody comes in, for example, somebody who only speaks English and they go to China and they can't speak Chinese. They are, I wouldn't say disabled because I tend to, for the things that are like socially defined as disability, they are at a disadvantage in China.
Right.
But if that same person is bilingual, then they can, they're fine.
Yeah. Can I say something to just to Diane? I know we kind of lost the piece where she said how her I think it was a sister. I can't remember who had a head injury and didn't like to be defined as having a disability. And I think sometimes in the work that I've done, I've seen people who maybe have a head injury or some sort of, I'm going to say disability just for lack of word, later in life, weren't necessarily born with it, so they didn't grow up sometimes with some of that association, and they get, they fall into that culture, whatever it might be later in life, whether they become blind, head injury, have to use a wheelchair, whatever it might be. And sometimes I think it can be harder, or they are less interested in maybe identifying as part of that group for whatever reasons. I just wanted to comment on that. So I think it's, it's again, you have to ask, when we're doing job development, we always ask, how do you want us to talk about you to the employer? What do you want us to share? Types of information do you think will be helpful? So we're very big on kind of asking. And I think that's important no matter what. Never make assumptions about.
Okay.
Sure, Melanie.
But to piggyback on that, in terms of professionalism, there are the field of at least employment for folks with disability or community employment for folks with disability. It's a hot field right now because of all the really good policy and employment first, and it's all good. But along with that, there's concern about skill levels of professionals, and so there's a lot of competency-based training out there now. And it clearly says in a couple of competencies that I'm aware of that professionals should be using person-first language. I mean, this has made me really think about that.
Right.
So, I mean, it's an official competency that employment specialists are being told in trainings, and
Right.
I'm, guilty, if you will, of
Including
doing
our
that.
trainings. We say that in our trainings.
Yeah, so, I mean, but there's nothing to say that we shouldn't still talk about person first versus identity
Well, I think
first
it's good
language.
to-
Right.
We need to work that in now.
Yeah.
Right.
Right, and then doing the, make sure you ask the person how they want to be described.
Right.
If you have to mention the disability.
Right. Jonathan, you
Because
had a
sometimes you
thought.
don't.
Yeah. When Alberta, when you mentioned language, your accent being maybe a disability, when you said that, I said, not really, but I can see how in some cases, especially at an airport or during a terror threat, that security, especially, that comes up a lot if you're like Middle Eastern. I think they have their mind in their mind that if you look a certain way or speak a certain way, you might be more apt of being thought or something.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Other thoughts? Other questions?
I thought that was very good. Thank you, Finn.
Yeah, thank you very
Thank you.
Thank you all for coming.
Yeah, thanks for joining everybody.
Like
So-
where your slides flip around there. Too.
I will send the slides around to everybody who is in the room or on the call. And we'll also make the recording available for people. Some people told me they wanted to be here for this and they weren't able to.
Yeah.
Thanks, everybody.